So this talk is indeed from a paper I'm doing together with Michael and Laura. And it began as this conversation about drilling, where it turns out that right now geothermal exploration has accidentally drilled into magma chambers in Africa, on Hawaii and Iceland. And this has not been quite as dramatic as one would expect. It has mostly led to a loss of a few drill bits and a bit of a scare. But the Icelandic people realized, wait a minute, we could do this deliberately. Let's do a test bed to actually connect to the magma in a volcano deliberately. One reason to do this is, of course, pure science. But there is another good reason, and that is above the magma chambers, there are brines, very, very hot water that has dissolved a lot of minerals that might actually be quite valuable in terms of containing gold, copper, and the dissolved lithium. In the past, of course, we have also been trying to redirect lava flows to some extent, with varying levels of success. Now, what I want to think about is volcano engineering. What if we continue this trend towards actually modifying volcanic systems to get human benefits? The obvious uses might be extracting energy on minerals, but people will immediately bring up, could we use this to prevent eruptions, or at least mitigate the consequences, or maybe even alter the kind of eruption that you would get, which might actually be quite valuable. So this seems to be an obvious thing to investigate. Is this a good idea? And that also leads to questions about ethics. What kind of values would underlie something like this? What should they think about? You could argue, and a lot of people in the earth sciences would say, we humans are too small to affect these vast, powerful systems. So it's kind of foolish to imagine that we could deal with them. But that's what we used to say about climate too. And by the point when we realized that we're actually controlling and affecting the climate, it might have been too late to get into a discussion about what's a sensible approach. Now, when it comes to proposals for doing volcanic engineering, they go back a fairly long time. Indeed, during the Second World War, a geology professor who should have known better was even proposing that maybe we should be bombing the Japanese volcanoes to trigger eruptions, and that's going to bring a swift end to the war. Fortunately, nobody really tried to follow through with that. Generally, it's pretty obvious that people are going to be trying to enhance geothermal power in the vicinity of volcanoes. The hotter the rocks are, the more thermal efficiency you can get. Developing extraction systems seems reasonable. Controlling lava flows, or at least trying to redirect them, has already been attempted. There might be an interesting question whether one could also put up screens to try to redirect pyroclastic flows. There is also work ongoing about draining or decarbonizing crater lakes, so they pose less of a risk of causing lahars or an outflow of carbon dioxide. An interesting question which haven't been studied that much is, could you add something to actually manage the aerosols? This looks slightly doubtful right now, but it is still an interesting possibility that one might do other things to mitigate the effect of an eruption. And finally, of course, could one actually cause a deliberate triggering or directing? And this might be more useful than it sounds. If we think about Mount St. Helens, the flank of that volcano broke and sent an enormous flow that killed several people. Imagine that you have a volcano and it might erupt in the direction to a city. You might then want to actually fracture the flank so it's erupting in a different direction. And it looks like we might theoretically have the means to do that in some circumstances, although this requires a lot of thinking. More importantly, perhaps from an existential risk standpoint, is can we do something about supervolcanoes? Perhaps the most thorough paper on this is Wilcox et al.'s paper on reducing temperatures in the Yellowstone caldera. And that paper shows that if you do a lot of cooling, then over the span of 16,000 years, which is much shorter than the likely eruption period, you might actually make it unlikely to erupt. There is a lovely review by Denkenberg and Blair that looks at all the possible ways of doing a more rapid intervention, although I think many of them requires quite a lot of work before we would be willing to do them. So what are the ethical problems here? Well, we obviously have a lot of good reasons to want to do this. We might want to reduce global catastrophic risk, which gives a tremendous weight to it. But we might also want to protect local communities. And even if we just want to do extraction of minerals, we still have to think about geoethical issues. A lot of this has to do with risk mitigation under uncertainty. Basically, we have critical phenomena that are truly random going on in Volcano. We have model uncertainty about what's going on inside the geothermal systems. And we are lacking data about the deep systems. So we might have to make decisions that later will turn out to be based on the wrong guesses. But these are fairly vanilla problems in many ways. It's just that we need to use the right principles and get people to agree that this is useful. You could approach it as a first do no harm principle, saying that we shouldn't do anything that could cause damage. But in many cases, we are wanting to avoid damage that would otherwise happen. So it might be better to do something. Precautionary approaches might say we should be very cautious, which is obvious, but still means that we want to investigate, that we might even want to do investigations on uninhabited islands and see if we can do something. The really interesting thing is, of course, stakeholders. So in the case of supervolcanoes, the stakeholders are everybody, but we also have local stakeholders. There are important issues about expectation management, actually showing that we don't overpromise too much or that we don't claim that we cannot do anything. There are interesting issues also about vested interest if we have something industrial. The military use of volcanoes is clearly against essentially every convention I've been able to find. So that one is pretty obviously ruled out. As my final point is, I think we can actually get quite far by stealing the Oxford geoengineering principles, and instead of using for the aerosols in the atmosphere, we use them for actual geology. And that seems to be a reasonable way of actually getting global and local stakeholders in the line. Very general enough to apply, and I think we can actually start investigating volcano engineering while thinking that we have some guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you. Almost exactly on 7 minutes. Really remarkable stuff. Okay, great. Question from the room.
This is Gordon Will. Anders, where is the interface between ethics and local politics in all this?
Oh, it's an important one. That picture to the lower right is Campo de Flegri outside Naples. And that is a potential big volcanic eruption happening in a big city. So seismologists and the volcanologists want to do test drilling, and the locals are getting involved in the politics. There is this entire chapter, which is a very Italian-style political drama about the locals fighting against the geologists trying to safeguard the community and the different points happening. This is a beautiful case study that politics and geology do mesh together, and you actually need to know enough of both. You need to have credence and trust in the local community to do it. Fortunately, in this case, the mayor showed up and became the kind of Oprah hero and convinced everybody that, yeah, they can do the drilling, it's safe enough, and I'm charismatic enough to convince my voters about it.
That's great. Other questions from the room? No. In that case, I'll just say thanks so much, Anders, and I'm sure people will follow up with you later. Thanks so much.